So let's get started, everyone. Good evening. So people are still entering, but we'd like to start our program for the night. So thank you all for joining us for our program tonight in honor of Black History Month, Shared Legacies, the African American Jewish Civil Rights Alliance, US and Canadian Perspectives. My name is Deidre Butler, and I'm a professor who teaches Jewish Studies in the religion program here at Carleton University. I'll serve as your MC for the evening. It is my pleasure to welcome you all as director of the Max and Tessie Zelikovic Center for Jewish Studies, and also on behalf of our partners, the United States Department of State, the History Program at Carleton University, and Temple Israel. As we begin this program that wrestles with painful history and looks to building bridges towards a more just future, it is most fitting that we acknowledge that Carleton University, and many of us participating tonight are from Ottawa and in Ottawa, gather together on land that is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. We come together tonight informed and inspired by the powerful film Shared Legacies, directed by Dr. Shari Rogers. We will begin the evening by viewing a clip from the film for those who have not yet had a chance to view it. Please note that Dr. Rogers has kindly made the film available to registrants of tonight's program until Friday. We'll then move to a short panel discussion between our discussants tonight and then open the floor to Q&A. As this is a webinar format, please do share your questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to integrate them into the panel discussion as well as the Q&A. We'll watch the trailer for Shared Legacies now.
There's an African proverb that says if the lions don't tell their stories, the hunters will get all the credit.
I'm telling you the story now because you're young lions and lionesses.
My great-grandfather had been in slavery, and it goes across generations. You just don't get rid of it simply because there are no chains on you.
The effects of slavery are still very prominent, just as the effects of the Holocaust are still very prominent amongst our brothers and sisters in the Jewish community.
The Jewish people have the DNA in their soul to look up close to what happened to African Americans after slavery.
We came to the South, young Jews, rabbis, many of them refugees from Nazi Germany. We hear Dr. King quoting the prophets. That was extraordinary. It made us proud.
Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said, "The future of America will depend on how it responds to Dr. King."
It was the work that Dr. King had spoken for, fairness, equality, against anti-Semitism, and for freedom for Soviet Jews.
A large Jewish presence in the civil rights movement was evident almost from the beginning.
Well, Stan Levinson and Harry Wachtell were lawyers who were working with Dr. King. They were advisors, marchers, fundraisers. They were in the thick of things.
Many Jewish students worked all across the South. And I will never, ever forget 3 young men, Andy Goodman, Micah Scherner, and James Shaney.
Birmingham is Birmingham.
We all know the Exodus is the central narrative of our redemption. And here is a modern situation. Shall we do nothing?
We could not have gotten anywhere had not Protestants, Catholics, and Jews showed up from all over the world.
Rabbi Yaakov Prince spoke immediately before Dr. King.
The most shameful and the most tragic problem is silence.
The civil rights challenges of our time, the human rights challenges of our day, they hang on me. They hang on you. They hang on who? They hang on us.
We all need to get together to find out the bigger picture. Those who have been stepped upon have to lead the way.
It's all about our humanity. And if we don't figure out a way truly to work together, we'll just be like hamsters on a wheel. The systemic oppression and issues will just continue.
That too many people living in fear. Your Rabbi Hersher and Martin Luther King Jr. were here today I think they would be saying, we need to pull together for a generation yet unborn.
The soul of America is at stake.
Thank you. In developing our panel discussion, we're committed to bringing together voices that could speak to Jewish and African American experience of the civil rights movement and its legacy, but also bridge American and Canadian experiences. The civil rights movement in the US continues to resonate powerfully here in Canada. We have our own history and all too present story of racism and violence here that continues to challenge us as a nation. I have asked each of our panelists to speak briefly in advance of our panel discussion together. So without further delay, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Shari Rogers, Director of Shared Legacies. Dr. Rogers is a licensed clinical psychologist and social activist whose work encompasses movie production, writing, educational programming, curriculum development, and public speaking. She's the co-executive producer of Ellie Inspiring Future Generations, a PBS documentary examining the impact of Holocaust survivor Eliezer Ayalon, a Yad Vashem tour guide from Israel, and his inspiration to make a positive change in the world. Dr. Rogers is the president and founder of Spill the Honey, an organization committed to promoting human dignity, as well as advancing public knowledge of the Holocaust and the civil rights movement. Shari also serves as a trustee of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. Thank you for sharing this film with us, Dr. Rogers.
Thank you. So grateful. It's wonderful to be with you all. So I'm just really excited about this time, even though there's a lot of pain in the world right now. I mean, that's at first and foremost. COVID has really, hit the world where we're all connected by this tragedy of this disease. But at the same time, it gives us an opportunity to kind of dig deep and in terms of talking about issues that are, that are sort of underneath the skin. We're not putting on our clothes, we're not going to events, and, it allows us to be more self-reflective. And at the same time in America, we're focusing, I think when the world saw the lynching of George Floyd, I think the combination of us all being in our homes and not being able to breathe, and watching a man not being able to breathe with a police officer literally taking the life breath out of this man, I think, made us finally realize that we need, as a nation, as a world nation, we haven't really we haven't worked on racism as much as we thought we had. We had a Black president in America, but we still have obviously a long way to go. I have 3 sons, and when they get in a car and they go out during the day or in the evening, and if they get pulled over by a police officer, as a mother, I've never once even thought about warning them about if a police officer pulls them over. It has never even entered my mind. It's not even, it's not even on my conscience. So the fact that as a woman and as a mother, that other mothers, Black mothers and Black fathers, this is on their mind, and they have to tell their children that, those folks that are supposed to be there, who, are supposed to protect you and are supposed to be there to help you, that you have to be afraid of them. What does that say, for America, or for, those folks who have that? What does that say? So for those of you who saw the movie, in the 60s, you saw Black men and women holding up a sign. The sign was, "I am a man." Can you imagine? In America, folks had to hold up a sign, a sign? A human being in the 60s had to hold up a sign that says, "I am a man." What does that say? So therefore, right now, there's a movement, Black Lives Matter. So I think this is, the 20th century sign that we have not, we have not dealt with the fact that for some reason, we still think Black lives don't have the same value as other people's lives. That's serious. That's really serious. But at the same time, I thought it was important to do this film on the African American Jewish Civil Rights Alliance because two different communities worked together during the civil rights movement, and they shared a common history of being seen as less human. The Jewish people, had just 30 years before the civil rights movement, were branded as basically worse than an animal. That they were, taken out of their stores, and while they looked like other Germans or other people, they had to wear a yellow star that says you're less human, and eventually burned to death. So when many of the folks who were living in America, when some of the Jewish people that were in America could identify with the Black struggle. So I think a lot of people are familiar with the famous picture of Rabbi Joshua Heschel and Martin Luther King. But what some folks don't think about is that Rabbi Joshua Heschel had 3 sisters murdered in Nazi Germany, and his mother. And, his daughter, who's a professor in her own right in Jewish history, talks about like her father could have come to America and not got out of bed. Some people, are so depressed and live in such despair if one person was murdered in their family. But the fact that that he had studied with Hasidic rabbis and took the Torah and the Exodus story and used it to realize that if it's just a history book, or if it's just a book that doesn't apply to man, to working with men, then it doesn't have the same power that it should have. And so he meets Dr. Martin Luther King in 1963. And if you haven't read when Dr. Martin Luther King and Rabbi Heschel first have the interchange in 1963 in Chicago, I ask everybody should read it because it's extraordinary. One of the comments that Rabbi Heschel says is that it was easier for the Israelites to cross the Red Sea than it is for Negroes to cross a college campus. That he was able to take a historical story of the Exodus, and bring it right down to where America was, standing when it came to how it treated its Black Americans. And he inspired many of the rabbis who, to really come out of the temple and work for civil rights. Just before obviously there's so many people here I can't wait to learn from, but why I made this film at this time, we started filming in 2015. It was the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March. And I had met one of Dr. King's legal advisors and attorneys who actually not only did he have a hand in drafting the I Have a Dream speech, but he made sure that speech was copywrote and made sure that the King family had it. But he also was told specifically by Dr. Martin Luther King at the time, this was I think about a week before he was murdered, that he said there was already anti-Semitic remarks going on. He said, he didn't call him Dr. Jones, he said Clarence, his name is Clarence Jones. He said, Clarence, I know you will be the one to remind, our Negro brothers of the 24/7 commitment of the Jewish people to our struggle. So I feel honored that before some of these civil rights leaders have passed on, we were able to get their testimony. And the film's really personal recollections of this coalition, and hopefully it just sparks people to learn so much more about this history that I couldn't, consolidate in this film. And we're going to be meeting Dr. Haynes later, and he has books and books and a recent book on the subject. So I hope it just lights the fire under people to go learn.
Thank you, Dr. Rogers. Our next panelist, Dr. Deborah Schultz, is Assistant Professor of History at Kingsborough Community College in the City University of New York, where she teaches civil rights, women's, and 20th century history. She's the author of Going South, Jewish Women in the Civil Rights Movement, and she has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Teagle Foundation, and the American Council of Learned Societies. Inspired by writing on Holocaust memory, her current research examines public memorialization of the U.S. civil rights movement. Welcome, Dr. Schultz.
Thank you so much, Dr. Butler. First, I'd like to thank Carleton University and the Zelikovitz Center for inviting me and us to have this conversation together. And I'd like to congratulate and thank Dr. Rogers for her deep, rich achievement with this film. In the very brief time that we have for comments, I thought perhaps the most useful thing I could do as a historian is suggest 3 ways we can think about the Black-Jewish alliances of the past more expansively, and perhaps 3 expansive ways to think about the future. Where do we go from here? So thinking about the past, as a historian, I would say we can't assume that it's a natural alliance and take it for granted. I think the film depicts the fact that it arose out of particular historical circumstances of 2 racialized and traumatized people. And that created great emotional, spiritual, and political resonance between these 2 communities at particular moments in history. Second, if we want to look at the true scope of the alliance, we must recognize, as I state in my book, that there are many ways of being Jewish. While rabbis and organizations made enormous contributions, large numbers of secular, unaffiliated Jews enacted Jewish values through their civil rights activism. How were they inspired to work for social justice in the past, and how can they be mobilized again? The third point that I'd like to make is about civil rights historiography. One of the key insights of that literature is that it was African-American women working at the local grassroots level, primarily in the South, who were the backbone of the movement. So that led me to ask, where are the invisible Jewish women, and what kinds of work are they doing? And what were their motivations for getting involved, putting their bodies on the line, particularly those who went south. And there were some reasons that were shared, motivational reasons that were shared with men, Jewish men, but also there were gendered reasons that came out of the mid-20th century historical experience. So those are some of the things I'd like us to add when we think about the past. And in terms of the present and future, I did talk about gender. We also have to talk about race and class. As Karen Brodkin asks in a very classic late 1980s essay, when did Jews become white folks? White skin privilege and assimilation enabled the spectacular socioeconomic rise of Jews in the 20th century, at least in the US. First, we have to recognize, as I'm sure we will in this conversation, that not all Jews are white. And for those of us who are, our allies have the right to ask, what aspects of our privilege are we not only willing to contribute when it's comfortable, but what are we willing to sacrifice? Are we willing to endure discomfort, as the film portrays beautifully Rabbi Susan Talve of St. Louis did in seeking to be an ally to the movement in Ferguson? Second, as freedom singer and historian Bernice Johnson Reagan has said many years ago, and Peter Yarrow, the beloved Peter Yarrow, says in the film, the civil rights movement was the borning struggle, the source for subsequent movements. And that's wonderful because we can now integrate insights and advances from the women's movement, the LGBTQ movement, environmental, disability rights, and other movements to combat oppression. Thinking intersectionally, as I think we will be asked to do, what does that mean? What does it mean that 3 Black queer women started Black Lives Matter, one of whom, Alicia Garza, identifies as or has a background that is both African-American and Jewish? Finally, and this is my own personal obsession, but it also happens to be a Jewish obsession, memory, zachor. I'm so grateful that this film preserves this very deep history of Black Jewish alliances, because it could easily be lost, as Dr. Rogers says. And now that civil rights veterans have started to pass on, are we doing enough to preserve their stories in all their contradictions and complexities, and making sure that those stories are visible on the landscapes of both of our countries? So these are some of the things I'd like to put out there, and I look forward to our conversation and to learning more about the Canadian experience. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schultz. Our next panelist, Dr. Bruce Haynes, professor of sociology at the University of California, Davis, conducts research in suburbanization, the Black middle class, race and racialization, and ethnic community organization. His publication includes Red Lines, Black Spaces, the Politics of Race and Space in a Black Middle Class Suburb, The Ghetto, Contemporary Global Issues and Controversies, Down the Up Staircase, perhaps my favorite title ever, 3 Generations of a Harlem Family, and most recently, The Soul of Judaism, Jews of African Descent in America, which won the 2019 Albert J. Raboteau Book Prize for Best Book in Africana Religions and is listed on the Jewish Book Council website. Welcome, Dr. Haynes.
Thank you so much. It's a really pleasure to be here. I want to thank you and Sherry for inviting me to this event. It's really an honor. I want to thank everyone who came to attend. I know you probably have other things you might be doing, so we really appreciate you committing your time to us and sharing in this conversation. I didn't prepare any formal words. I actually wrote a few ideas down, and I'm going to piggyback off of what Sherry had said about the Black talk, and then maybe comment a little bit about Black-Jewish relations. So first about the Black talk. When I was listening to Sherry talk about it, the thing that struck me was remembering, I was born in 1960, and I grew up with a father who was a parole officer in the South Bronx. When he retired, he had been there for 35 years. When I started driving, and I think it was 1977 or so, I got the Black talk. And this is from someone in law enforcement. And this was about how one needed to behave if you were going to engage with police officers, that any kind of sudden movement might be perceived as threatening. You know, reaching for your wallet, don't reach for your wallet, don't reach to the glove compartment, put both hands on the steering wheel and don't even roll down your window. And that's the kind of instructions I got in order to stay safe back in the 70s. I got my degree in 1995 and started teaching and landed at Yale. And one of the first things I got involved in doing was being engaged in a public forum about police brutality in New Haven. Now, what was interesting, if we remember the 1990s, police brutality was very much on the minds of Black Americans. But what happened after 9/11 is essentially, we forgot about it. And so we're really talking about an issue that has characterized my entire existence on this planet and predates me for some time. In fact, the history of racial violence really is part of the system of containment to segregated communities and must be understood as such. And so we really can't understand police violence without understanding segregation. The second thing I want to talk about is Black-Jewish relations. It's a topic particularly close to my heart. I grew up in Manhattan in New York. I went to a predominantly Jewish prep school. My first mentor was a gentleman by the name of Jay Shulman. Dr. Shulman founded the National Jury Project. Dr. Shulman protested with Black and Puerto Rican students in the 1960s, and that led to him being fired at CCNY. And he took me under his wing when I was, after I was in college. I was a school bus dispatcher. That was the best job I could find after a private school education. I was working for a private school bus company in New York. And Dr. Shulman took me under his wing. I did applied research, and it was from there that I went to graduate school. And so the topic of Black-Jewish relations is something that's very close to home and has really important consequences for both Blacks and Jews in the United States. One of the things I think we often overlook is that anti-Semitism and racism pretty much stem from the same origins in our society. And as we've seen the rise in racist rhetoric, we've also seen the rise in anti-Semitic rhetoric. And as we've seen a rise in racial violence against Blacks and even against Asians, we've also seen a rise in violence against Jews. So I think we really need to connect the dots here and understand that whether we like it or not, our fates are linked. And we have both moral and self-interested reasons for being committed to reestablishing or rekindling this long-held historic alliance. So I think I'll stop there and pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haynes. So in recognition that the story of race in Canada is distinct in important ways, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Isaac Sani, Director of the Transition Year Program at Dalhousie University. The groundbreaking program established in 1970 to redress the educational barriers and injustices that confront the Mi'kmaq Nation, other Indigenous peoples, and the African Nova Scotian community. His teaching and scholarship encompass Africa, the Caribbean, the US Civil Rights Movement, Cuba, and Black Nova Scotian history. He's the author of the acclaimed book, Cuba, A Revolution in Motion, and is currently finishing Africa's Children Return, Cuba, Africa, and Apartheid's End. He's a longtime community activist and participant in the anti-war movement and the anti-racist struggle, and is the co-chair and national spokesperson for the Canadian Network on Cuba. His roots lie in the Black Nova Scotian community and the Caribbean. Sani's family also has connections to the Jewish community. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, and I appreciate the invitation to speak today. I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm speaking from Halifax, which is on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation, and also perhaps from the province in which Blackness in Canada, in a sense, has its birth. We have the longest standing Black population here in Canada, and my mother's is from that community. Also, as I'm a unique person, having my roots in the Caribbean, and people probably can pick out a Trinidad and Tobagonian accent. And I also have all the religions in my family, all the denominations of Christianity, Hindus, Muslims, and Jews. And so I've done Passover, been to synagogue quite often, and so on. So I'm unique in that area, having, in a sense, participated in all religions, and therefore having the possibility of rejecting all of them. In that sense, right? But we talk about it. One thing I'd like to say as well, and it's come out in some of the discussions, is quite often the Black Canadian history is sort of eluded in the Canadian national discourse. People know much more about what happens in the United States, and there's a fundamental Canadian conceit that Canada is not the United States. Slavery is something that happened in the United States. It didn't happen in Canada. While Canada was a slave society, or what was the Canadas was a slave society into the 1830s, and it's been extremely well documented itself. And I'm actually writing a book after I finish my book on Cuba and Africa on slavery in Nova Scotia. Canada, Jim Crow and segregation is something that happened in the United States, but we have a history of segregation here in Canada, and the Ku Klux Klan actually organizing and being very active. You know, we often see Canada as being the end point of the Underground Railroad. 30 to 40,000 people of African descent, liberating themselves, escaping from slavery, set up communities, places like Amherstburg and Buxton, right? Most in Southern Ontario, most of them leaving, some of them went to other parts of Canada. But Canada has this history. And when George Floyd exploded, when the multiracial, multi-ethnic, but Black-led protests exploded in the wake of the May 27 horrendous murder, killing, lynching of George Floyd, it had a resonance here in Canada because we have a history of the disproportionate incarceration of people of African descent, and we also have a history of racial profiling. And so in my small city of Halifax, barely maybe 150, 200,000 people, we had over 10,000 people take a kneel, white, primarily white, but, led by Black activists in the city. So Canada has this particular history. But just as we, in a sense, think the civil rights movement did not take place in Canada, but was something that Canadians looked at passively unfolding in the United States, and only recently have we really begun to develop what is Black Canadian studies. It's in its infancy. When we talk about Black Jewish relationships in Canada, the reference always begins by talking about Black Jewish relationships in the in the United States. So this is also in its infancies. So I will highlight some things just recently that's happened. You know, the first Black leader and second Jewish leader of a major, so-called major federal party in Canada was just elected, and that's Anna Mae Paul, who converted to Judaism in 2000. We also have, in the wake of what's happening in George Floyd, the B'nai B'rith Canada, the Atlantic Jewish Council, the Federation of Canadian Jews, taking stances against anti-Black racism. So these are things that have taken place fairly recently. And there's even an MIU, a Memorandum of Understanding between the Canadian Black Chamber of Commerce and the B'nai B'rith of Canada. So you have all of these things that are unfolding. But what's really, and I'm also involved here in Canada, in what's called Halifax Equity Watch, which is primarily led by Judy and Hilary Haven, who are two prominent Jewish activists and professors here. What's interesting is one of the most prominent scholars on racism in Canada is Frances Henry. I mean, she often says, like, you know, she identifies culturally and historically as being Jewish. She comes from a Jewish family, but she doesn't practice Judaism, right? And she's published a number of really important books on racism in Canada. For example, The Color of Democracy, Racism in Canadian Society. She's focused a lot on the Caribbean diaspora. So while my part of Canada is sort of the historical root of the emergence of Blackness in Canada, in terms of political weight, in terms of sheer numbers, Toronto, for example, together at Montreal, but primarily Toronto, primarily through Caribbean immigration, has now become the focal point of Black Canadian identity and Black Canadian struggle. And she's written a lot on the Caribbean diaspora as well. She's written on racial profiling, and her most recent book was The Equity Myth, which looked at the problem of advancement and equity in terms of Black and Indigenous equity and decolonization of the universities. So in that sense, there are a lot of things that are happening contemporarily, right? But what's also interesting, and it's very interesting at my university, Dalhousie University, we have Dr. Lisa Chitofsky, who's Jewish, who's just published a very powerful book on hip hop called Hip Hop as Philosophical Text and Testimony. Can I Have a Witness? And it's quite a profound book that actually looks at hip hop as not just simply some sort of artistic form or artifact, but as a serious interrogation of the social relations that we live in. When we talk about Black-Jewish relations, right? You know, obviously Martin Luther King figures very large in this, right? And Martin Luther King actually visited Canada on a couple of occasions. But on March 15, 1962, he was hosted by the Holy Blossom Temple by Rabbi Gunther Plant. And he gave a very powerful lecture, obviously against segregation, but drew in comparisons, drawing on Bloom's work of the I and the thou and the I and the it, right? Drawing on that as an epistemology, right? To articulate some aspects of the similarities and the intersections of the African-American struggle and that of Jewish people. It was interesting is that when he was in jail in Birmingham in 1963, the Holy Blossom Temple, under Milton Gatsby, organized not only a benefit concert that Harry Belafonte participated at, but a significant fundraising event. What happened was that eventually, just a couple of days later, the temple was broken into and the proceeds were stolen. And King wrote a very powerful letter, right, talking about justice, right, and talking about at the end of the day, the long arc, as he's often said, the long arc of history bends towards justice as well. What some people may not know as well is that in 1968, obviously in the wake of the uprisings that occurred in King's assassination, Eldridge Cleaver, obviously due to a shootout with police, was sought by the FBI. He became a fugitive. He actually was smuggled into Montreal by a group of progressive Jews, right? And actually ended up staying at the home of Henry and Carol Zemel, right? Eventually, he actually ended up going to Cuba and then to Algeria, right? And he had very interesting conversations. I mean, it sort of belies the fact that eventually Eldridge Cleaver took a very bizarre political turn, becoming not only a born-again Christian, but an extremely conservative Republican. I remember having conversations with Phil Hutchins, who's a very good friend of mine, who was the last chairperson of SNCC, and who actually had various encounters with Eldridge Cleaver in the 60s and then later in the 80s as well, right? What's really stands out is quite often Black intellectuals who are trying to theorize and understand what it is to be Black in Canada. I mean, Canada has often been described as the most fractured diasporic community in terms of the African experience. But we have people trying to understand what it means to be Black, the tensions, the contradictions in Canada, by looking at what it meant to be Jewish in Canada as well. Those tensions from the Keep Canada White policy, which not only discouraged Black immigration, but Chinese immigration, but also was extremely anti-Semitic. We only remember the St. Louis, which was turned back of, people fleeing what was eventually going to be the Holocaust, right? Fleeing from Germany in the ships, right? And being turned back by Canada. In fact, Canada actually had the worst policy in accepting Jewish refugees of all of the countries of the West. In fact, government officials said that 0 Canadian Jewish refugees in Canada was too many, and so forth. So we have that history. And so you have people like Austin Clarke, who's passed on, a Barbadian author of African descent, who in his work, The Meeting Point, tried to sort of articulate what it meant to be Black Canadian by looking at the contradictions and ambiguities of being Jewish in Canada as well. We have the award-winning book by David Austin, a Montrealer, called Fear of a Black Nation, Race, Sex, and Politics in 1960s Montreal, that won the Casa de las Americas Prize. And it focuses on the politics in Montreal, but also it focuses particularly on the Black Writers' Congress that took place in October of 1968, the largest gathering of Black revolutionaries in North America. And what's interesting about that, a key person behind behind the scenes was Carrie Levitt, or Carrie Polanyi Levitt, the daughter of the famous economist Carl Polanyi. Carrie Levitt herself is a giant in the field of development economics. Even though she's still in the 90s, she continues to write. And she was very active in the Black struggle in Canada and also in the Caribbean, hosting luminaries such as Lloyd Best and others, and C.L.R. James at her home. And what's interesting is the RCMP, when they were obviously surveilling all of these Black activists and these Black revolutionaries, were concerned about two things. One, about the importation of Black radical politics from the United States into Canada via these, the Black Panthers and Black Power. And they were also concerned that this woman, who was Jewish, but they perceived as white, was hosting all of these Black men in her home. And they became very concerned about, Black men having sex with white women. It's actually in the FBI documents. So I encourage people to read David Austin's work. So this relationship, the Black Canadian relationship, Black Canadian and Jewish relationship in Canada, is in its infancy of studies, right? I've just hinted on some points. And before we began the webinar, we had a conversation as we were gathering, and discovered that one of the people on the panel here, participants, attended Concordia University. And Concordia University originally was known as Sir George Williams University. It's the actual fusion of two universities. And in 1969, one of the most famous events takes place in which Black students are protesting the racism of a particular professor who was actually teaching biology. His name was Perry Anderson, right? Not to be confused with Perry Anderson, the economist who's published so much in the New Left Review. And so they protested. And this was a joint struggle, not just of Black students, primarily from the Caribbean, but of white students as well, massive meetings and so forth. And Jewish students participated in this. And there's a very powerful documentary called The Ninth Floor, because the computer center was on the ninth floor. The students eventually occupied the computer center as a means of protest. We suspect, though we can't prove, that an RCMP provocateur was infiltrated who set a fire in order to give a pretext for the police violence and repression that followed. And one of these Jewish students was charged as well. And he appears within the documentary. And there were other Jewish students as well. And so what is lacking in research here in Canada as well is looking at this, how the civil rights movement, particularly when it radicalized into the Black Power movement, and you had this proliferation of left-wing groups, Marxist, Leninist groups, and other groups as well, that took place in the United States in the 60s and the 70s. It took place here in Canada as well. And there was significant amount of Jews who disproportionately played very important roles, not only in the political struggle, but in trying to theoretically understand what Canada was and where indigenous peoples and people of African descent faced. I'll end my comments by focusing on what is a very unusual event, which I am actually going to publish something on, because one of the members of this unusual event is a very close personal friend of mine. As some of you may be aware that in the so-called communist movement and left movement in the world, there was what was called the Sino-Soviet split. And coming out of this was a small group called Hammer and Steel in New England, right, which split with the Communist Party, took the Chinese side. It was led by Homer Chase, who was also of Jewish origin. When he passed away, he actually had an obituary published in the New York Times. And eventually this group, began to focus on and analyze that one of the central issues in the United States was the indigenous issue and the African-American issue. But they also believed that the United States was on the verge of fascism. This is in the 70s. They were thinking of this. So perhaps they were maybe 40 years too late, too early in their prediction, some people have argued, right? They made the decision to decamp from New England to Nova Scotia. And they came to Nova Scotia, primarily a small group who are mostly composed of Jews, right? Who began to write very powerful things, shall we say, articulate Marxism to more take into context national oppression and racial oppression, particularly on the indigenous and African American experience. And they developed a very close relationship with the Republic of New Africa, and also began to form links with the African Nova Scotian community here, and eventually brought several members of the Republic of New Africa to tour through these various communities, right? And so, in a sense, we're just at the beginning of trying to understand what is the Black Canadian experience. We're at the beginning of Black Canadian studies. We're about to launch at my university the first Black and African Diaspora Studies program that will focus on Black Canadian studies. And part of this, I think, will be excavating, elaborating the many links between the Black Canadian struggle and the Jewish struggle in Canada, but how even the African diaspora links to the Jewish diaspora, both in North America. So this is an area, it's an embryonic field, rich for research, rich for graduate students to come and explore what I think will be a very fascinating and rich area. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Seni. Your passion is infectious. Before we wrap up these introductions, it's my pleasure to welcome and to have Ms. Sherry Douglas, a representative of Temple Israel's Anti-Racism Task Force, to join us tonight. Sherry Douglas is a partner and mother of 2 sons. Her background is in healthcare and social services with a passion for social justice and inclusion for all. Her experience includes working in the US inner-city clinics, here at home in Canada with Indigenous youth and many other marginalized groups. So first, I have to say, Sherry, brave of you to come on with all these professors. So thank you for being with us and bringing us back to ground.
Thank you so much, Deidre. And thank you to everyone, to all the wonderful panelists for sharing all of your expertise, all of your knowledge. I'm so incredibly grateful to be here tonight. I certainly have a different perspective, as we all do, coming from a non-academic background, absolutely very different as well. A little bit about me, my background, obviously I'm a Black woman, but I'm a mixed Black woman of Caribbean and Middle Eastern descent. Right after high school, I'm from Montreal. Right after high school, graduated, moved to Los Angeles, was there for 18 years. And while I was there, met my ex-husband, got married, had my children, and I worked in healthcare. And interestingly enough, in the last few years that I was there, I worked for a Jewish doctor in a predominantly Jewish community. And I had this very strong sense of kinship and connection. I do remember that. And that's something that has stayed with me for forever and will stay with me. Tying this all into the film, I loved this film, absolutely. My hats go off to you, Sherry, for such a wonderful film. I loved to see how this historical lineage of Blacks and Jews coming together in support of civil rights. And watching this gave me so much hope. It really gave me hope that here in Canada, we can establish the same type of connection between the Jewish and the Black community. But even extending it further, Blacks and Indigenous people, we have so much history here between our marginalized groups, our oppressed groups, so much shared history. And I would love to see this come together, where we come together, where we're actually able to create these types of alliances like we see and have seen in US history. But like you shared, Dr. Isaac, you know, I too recognize that this is all very brand new here in Canada. So I feel like we are in the beginning stages of this, and I would love to see where this goes. Because of that, I was so drawn to the anti-racism task force that we have started with Temple Israel, and which is being led by Rabbi Michael Berg. And I realized the work that was being done at Temple, but that still needed to be done. And it's through this, I'm seeing that we've had this sense of commitment. We're examining, you know, ourselves, we're examining our own biases, we're examining our own actions, we are questioning, we are seeking community support, we're learning from one another, and we're doing our best to create inclusive environments for everyone, but specifically for Jews of color and Black Jews more specifically. As a Jewish woman myself, this is so important because not only am I having the experience of a Jew, but as a Jew, you know, of color. And so my experience has been completely different, not always positive in Jewish spaces. And I've been so incredibly fortunate that at Temple, for the most part, it's been wonderful. It's been very open and welcoming. But I realize we have such a long way to go. And I can tell you, I've had countless experiences that have not been positive. So I'm just wonderful that we're creating this fertile ground for these things to happen, for conversations to happen, for change to happen within not just our synagogue, but to extend this out into other Jewish spaces, and then, you know, the community as a whole. Because isn't that what it's about, right? We're impacting ourselves and we're changing ourselves so that we can then impact the world. So I'm certainly hopeful that that will be the case, and that it will be experienced in the community. And I'm very happy that we're starting that here today. Thank you very
much. So I see that we've got a couple of comments and a question coming into the Q&A. We're going to have a bit of a panel discussion together, but I'm keeping an eye on that Q&A. So please do share your questions there, and I'll try and integrate them. So I intended to start our panel discussion with a question about intersectionality, which Dr. Schultz mentioned, and all of you have kind of pulled on in different ways. But I'd like to layer that with a question of memory, because you know, your film, Dr. Rogers, is so much about memory, the memory that we have and that we don't have. And all of you in different ways have talked about memory that's lost and kind of the memory we're trying to retain and we're trying to engage. And I just invite anyone on the panel to comment briefly on it, and perhaps we can have a little bit of a roundtable discussion. Would anyone like to open things up a bit? Dr. Haynes, please.
Thank you for that question. I guess I'd like to take the first one, which is intersectionality. I wasn't planning to talk about my own research tonight, but Cherie's comments really bring home, I think, something that should be said here, which is the Jewish community is changing, and the demographics of the Jewish community is changing quite dramatically. I have a book called The Soul of Judaism that maps the changing face of Jews of African descent. And one of the things that come up in the book is exactly the things Cherie refers to. Jews of color, Black Jews in particular, often feel challenged about their Jewishness, seen as being out of place, questioned about their Jewishness, feeling they have to prove themselves often. And so I talk about this problem in my book. I also talk about Jewish racism and Black anti-Semitism, which again, I'm sure Cherie might have experienced all of these things. But I think the important thing is, what I want to emphasize is that there is this really rich resource right here in the Jewish community. literally some 10 to 13% of the Jewish community is now non-white. The latest surveys are showing a consistent diversification of the American Jewish community. And that's from conversion, that's from intermarriage, that's from adoption. There are many different sources of this. And I think that before looking to the Black community per se, maybe what should be done is looking internally to Black Jews who are already a natural bridge to the Black community. And so I think that's where I wanted to take the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And we saw a bit of that in the film as well, when you had some Jews of color who were speaking that way, Dr. Rogers. Would anyone else like to add to this? Dr. Schultz, please.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely agree with Dr. Haynes about the bridging. I would also say another resource are traditionally white Ashkenazi Jewish civil rights veterans who have been in the trenches. That's why I was interested in studying them, who actually, put their bodies on the line to be anti-racist allies and have lessons to share about humility, about following Black leadership, about what to say and not to say in, current movements. So I hope that people will also look at them as a resource as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Sani, please.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting topic. When Sherry was speaking, I often, when I be Sonica, people say, you don't look Jewish, right? Okay. And of course, as a Caribbean, I'm becoming Trinidad, I identify myself as internationalist, right? Okay. But it's very interesting to have that context. But working in groups such as Canadian Arabs and Jews for Just Peace in the Middle East and being involved in the Black communities, are giving me this interesting, shall we, view on how on these kind of intersections. But what's really interesting, I want to get back to the point that was just made about this experience that people have, right? So I'm a Cuba specialist, and and in, for example, my work on Cuba, particularly in terms of people who support the Cuban Revolution, people who were involved in, for example, the Southern African liberation struggle. There's so many people of Jewish origin who were involved in that struggle, right? Okay, and who played such central roles and are so incredibly humble, right? Okay, and I've been trying to get people who I know, some of them are non-Jewish, but a lot of them are, to write their memoirs, right? And they always say they haven't played this very important role, okay? That they were just making a commitment. And that always stands out to me because I think we're living in a moment, if you're on social media, where everybody has personalized what it means to struggle against oppression. I call it the neoliberalism of the struggle against oppression. That's my term for it, right? Because everything becomes personalized and people have given up the idea of collective struggle, right? In that sense, right? And I think this kind of humility and this focus on the collective struggle, right? That I've seen in so many of the people I've interviewed who have become my close friends. One of them is like my second mother when I'm in Cuba, really drives them a very important lesson that can be learned. We live in a time, I'm in movements where there's a fetishization of youth. Yes, we have to rejuvenate. Yes, you have to bring new faces in. And yes, we have to make sure that their voices are silent. But it should not be a fetishization that throws out the wisdom, right? And the example of those who were stalwarts in the struggle before. And as I said, the people I've interviewed and perhaps, and as was said before, epitomes and repositories of this kind of humility.
Thank you. I'd like to bridge this actually to something that Dr. Schultz mentioned, which is this idea of Jewish whiteness and when Jews became white folks. We have a comment from a daughter of a Holocaust survivor, and she says, although the color of my skin is white, I have always been considered as other, not a white person. And of course, recently, Wonder Woman, Gal Gadot, we had the issue of whether or not she was white or not as a Middle Eastern woman. And so part of the conversation about whiteness and Jewishness and racialization is that Jews have white privilege except when they don't. So I'm wondering if anyone wants to speak to that in terms of alliances and bridges. So Dr. Haynes, you were first with your hand up.
There we go. Yes, this idea that Jews are ambivalently white. There are times when they're not be considered white. But I'd like to take the long view of Jewish history. And I think when we take the long view of Jewish history, there clearly is a orientalization of Jews and a racialization of Jews, at least from the 15th into the early 19th century. And it's only in the late 19th century did we create the idea of ethnicity that allowed Jews to position themselves as being both Jewish and American. But I want to remind people in the 18th century, people were very clear that Jews were very much considered to be racially different. The Nazi Nuremberg laws, jumping to the future, they're actually piggybacking off of the American segregation and dissent laws. And so we really see the attempt to racialize Jews in Nazi Germany. So if we really want to talk about Jews as white, we're talking about, a pretty short history relative to the 500 year post, Middle Ages, say, Jewish experience. And so part of the reason I wrote my book, in fact, was looking at the role of racialization with regards to Jews and Blacks. And I basically argue that not only did Blacks have to navigate the color line when it was drawn in the 19th century, but so did Jews. And in fact, the notion that Jews were non-white has continued to be a subtext in sort of colloquial conversations in American society. And it wasn't until the 1960s that UNESCO did a scientific study where they finally declared Jews were in fact not a race. So the question about Jews and whether or not Jews are white or not has been an ongoing debate ever since colonialism constructed political whiteness.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And Dr. Schultz, you'd like to add?
Yes, I totally agree with Dr. Haynes' comments. I just want to underscore that we have to look, we have to kind of have a double consciousness of the long history that Dr. Haynes is invoking, and also the context of the societies that we're looking at. But just to reinforce his point, one of my most powerful teaching moments in my own classes is when I share with my students that on my grandmother's naturalization papers from the 1930s, there's a line that says race, and above it, it says Hebrew. So that in a primary document really captures what we're talking about in a very powerful way.
Thank you so much. I just want to note to everyone in our audience, we're transitioning kind of nicely into Q&A as well, as I'm paying attention. So if you have questions, please do put them there. I have my eye on them. And Dr. Sani, I think, wants to add something to our last question.
I think this has been a very rich discussion, and it kind of reminds me of how the Irish became whiter in that sense, right? This whole idea that these identities, right, and the various way they're multi-layered, and then they contribute to oppressions, or they contribute to people of greater access, differential access to societal privileges, right? Are constructed, right? And the same thing, just blackness and whiteness are constructed in the heat of the colonial settler state. And I think these things are really critically important for people to understand. I mean, when we live in times like this, we take the experiences we have, unfortunately, as being time immemorial and immutable, without understanding, right, how historically malleable they are.
I'd like to add something. As our film is being used as a tool to talk about memory and to build bridges, if you will, of understanding. The other night we were in Connecticut, and it was fascinating. An NAACP president came on, not the national one, but a particular president, and he said, people don't realize that our most sacred award is the Spingard Award that we give out every year to, highlight somebody who's done amazing work in civil rights. And it's named after a Jewish man. So while I think, people who study this history know this, the fact that he is now talking about this is significant, to me is significant, because, you know, there's all these connections that seem, you know, that are so there and so obvious, but it's giving voice sometimes to the connections in the present that really can be, inspire study. So for instance, when there's just been this twin win in Georgia for the first time in history, the first Black senator, who happened to be the Reverend in Dr. Martin Luther King's church, the Ebenezer Church. And then the first Jewish senator, Senator Ossoff, who was actually trained under Congressman John Lewis. What makes it so extraordinary is, at least for me it was, when Senator Warnock was on CNN, you know, he could have just talked about his win. But when he said, Dr. Martin Luther King and Rabbi Heschel, you know, would be shining down on this win, that was extraordinary, I thought. There was another example of how history, you know, inspires the present, but also how our present can inspire, you know, looking back at history.
Yeah. If I may add something, sorry, but I think when we think of memory, and I was actually just finished watching the 14th, the Amendment, this new Will Smith documentary with all of these historians on Netflix about the 14th Amendment, right? And what's interesting when they get to the struggle, what's really interesting, and people have eluded this deliberately because of a fundamental anti-communism. If you go back, there's really a radical roots that begin in the 20s and the 30s with communist organizers, things like the Black Brotherhood, right? And so you have Black communists, you know, whatever we may think of communism, and a significant portion of the people who are active in the Communist Party are Jews. And so when we have the Scottsboro case, okay, you know, it's basically, in a sense, African Americans and Jews who are working closely together, right? And of course, you know, lay the foundation, not only for the civil rights movement and the organizing principles and the skills, but for the radicalization later on. And also what's interesting as a historian of Africa is when we look at the Holocaust, right? When we look at that takes place, in German history, there's also the Herero massacre that precedes this, okay? The deliberate attempt to eliminate the Herero and the Nama people, right? And that clearly, you know, and people has an echo in German policy, just as the Germans are drawing the Nuremberg laws on the Jim Crow laws and the eugenics laws. In fact, they even draw some of it on the eugenic laws that existed in Canada, in Saskatchewan, right? This is one thing people tend to forget, that the founder of the new Democratic Party in Canada, who's much so heralded and so forth, was a eugenicist. Now, I don't think he ever publicly, and I don't know if he was, I'm not trying to say that he didn't publicly repudiate that. But we also have in German history, concretely, the Herero genocide, right? The attempt to eliminate them, right? And so we have these sort of very profound historical connections between the Black experience and that of, the Jewish people, or peoples.
Thank you. Before we turn to some questions about gender that I'm seeing, we have a question. It's from my sister-in-law, so I'm afraid I have to share it, who asks, what are your thoughts on the term caste rather than race as popularized by Isabel Wilkerson? Would anyone like to take that? Yes, please.
I still want to piggyback off of what was just said. So I want to go back to the socialism thing, because I think it's really, I don't want to brush that by. Because Jews and Blacks met each other in labor. That's where we met. And in fact, when you look at the early labor protests, Jews are helping organize Black labor to some degree, particularly in the 30s and 40s. But I also want to remind us that, you know, Blacks had their own tradition of left thinking, where we had Asa Philip Randolph, who was the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, who eventually became the head of the AFL-CIO. And he was an avid socialist. And so, the notion that Jews and Blacks were on a similar path and even living in similar overlapping neighborhoods is quite true throughout the 20th century until we get to the 60s. And there, it's the economic mobility of Jews that place us in literally different places. And that's the challenge before us when we talk about the future and having Black-Jewish relations. We're no longer in the same workplaces, we're no longer overlapping communities, and the class divide is deep.
Thank you. And anyone want to take the caste category or terminology? Sure.
Well, I like to say Black Agenda Report had a excoriating review of her book, right? Okay. Excoriating. I mean, Glenn Ford is, I must say, he wields a polemic cutlass, right? I was going to say machete, right? As no one does, right? And of course, people, obviously have forgotten Oliver Cox's Word, Color, Caste, and Race, which emerged in the 40s, which, it may be dated, but it's still a seminal and definitive reference point in terms of trying to basically say, well, caste and race are two separate things, right? Okay. And that what happens, people have, and I agree with this argument even before it, what it tends to do, it tends to in my point, obscure and elite the capitalist structures, right? And the class structure that undergirds this, right? And what it does is it places the ideational above material transformation, right? And I think that's where the central error is. And what it does, and this comes back to the problem with the this documentary I was talking about on Netflix. It's really interesting, and I would use it in a classroom. But what it does, it's really constructed to say, well, listen, the current structures we have, socioeconomic in the United States, aren't bad because they can actually bring about true meaningful change, right? And it's really a question of changing things on the ideational level. I disagree with that. I think we need fundamental socioeconomic change, revolutionary radical transformation, right? And I think that's the problem with, when we begin to use terms like caste, which have, and there's a whole debate on what does it mean in India as well, right? When you go through the literature and so on.
Yeah, could I follow up with that? Caste is for me, we forget that there was actually a caste school of race relations in the 1950s that talked about caste. And there they were emphasizing, as Dr. Sine indicated, the cultural realm, the paternalism, the feelings of cultural reciprocity between Blacks and whites in the South. But what that does is it obscures the fact that slavery is labor exploitation, plain and simple. And what we're talking about politically is the granting of property rights to white men to literally own Black men. So we're talking about deeply entrenched political rights that are deeply tied to economics. And caste obscures that relationship and turns it into a question of culture when we're really talking, as Dr. Sine indicated, a problem of structural deprivation, of material deprivation, of segregation and the like.
So I wanted to get us to gender, but before we go way too far from what we're talking about right now, we have a couple of questions about the Jewish community itself. So I grew up in Montreal at Temple Emmanuel. It became Temple Emmanuel Beth Shalom. There's a lead rabbi there, Rabbi Stern, who I remember going into his office and there's a picture of him with Martin Luther King. And like that held pride of place. That was a Reform synagogue. One of our questions comes from David Brooks, who says, having come from our experience with the US civil rights movement before we moved to Canada, and having just seen the wonderful movie, we were aware then and were reminded again by the movie that the great majority of rabbinic support came from the Reform movement. Now, of course, Abraham Joshua Heschel wasn't Reform, but okay. Is this still the case, especially in Canada? So I'm not sure, I guess maybe I'm answering that. But aside from Canada, maybe we could just comment about where allies are found in the Jewish community, perhaps historically in the contemporary context, and then I'll try and help with Canada. Anyone have any thoughts? You were nodding, Professor Haynes, so I think you're on.
I'm sorry, what's the question? The question again
So,
is?
so just this idea that there is a congruence between kind of progressive Jewish denominational movements and alliances in the civil rights movement and since.
So I think it's really hard to generalize about people within movements. And but I would say that in terms of the movements themselves, the reform movement appointed a person maybe 5 years ago as director of hospitality. Her name is April Baskin. She's a Jew of color who had been groomed for leadership within the Jewish community. And so I've been watching her since she was in college be groomed into these kinds of positions. And just recently I saw that Jewish Renewal, I believe, just appointed someone, if I'm not mistaken, to a similar director of diversity kind of position. So these two movements, I feel, are starting to recognize the diversity within, and I do think that's where it starts.
So, I mean, I would say as someone who studies the Jewish community here in Canada, and especially around issues of personal status, that part of this, and I think you alluded to this earlier, Dr. Haynes, is that many of the Jews of color that are in the Jewish community are there because of adoption and conversion and intermarriage and all these things, which is happening more at the progressive end of the spectrum than it is in the more traditionally observant end of the spectrum. So that might be part of the story, but also this idea that especially Reform Jews, and I think this is what David Brooks is getting at, understand themselves as Judaism being centered in this kind of quest for social justice, and that being central to Jewish identity, even more than halakha, for example, as well. Okay, I'm keeping an eye on the time, and we're going a little bit later. I'm hoping to wrap up by 8:30 because there's some people from the West Coast and all over the world. But before we go, just a couple of thoughts about women and gender in these movements. Dr. Rogers, in your film, we see women, and but we don't have so much of the history, and that's perhaps what you were alluding to, Dr. Schultz. But anyone, if you'd like to comment on what it does to include women in this history and where you see them in that history, I guess, and the future. Please, Dr. Schultz.
Well, I appreciate Dr. Saneh's invocation of the tradition of Jewish radicalism, because that's a place where you will find Jewish women historically. And part of what I was trying to do is to surface that tradition and to claim it and make it more visible. In terms of Jewish women's participation later in the context of the 20th century US, what I was alluding to before when I talked about the differentiation between Jewish women's and men's kind of paths to civil rights activism was the fact that in mid 20th century America, Jewish women were sent to college without any expectation or clear guidance about what happened the day you graduated. So a number of the women that I interviewed said, they graduated and they just didn't understand what they were supposed to do with all of this knowledge and passion that they had accumulated. So when the civil rights movement put out the call, obviously they were committed for political reasons, but I don't think it detracts from their politics to say that there was also an element of, personal liberation to be able to commit to something, to creating meaning as part of a movement that was challenging US democracy. So that was really the point that I wanted to make about gender.
And I just want to add to that I think the civil rights movement, laid a foundation that empowered the women's movement. But I had interviewed, we have about 100 interviews that we couldn't include in the film because anybody who's made a film before knows that the hardest part is, choosing what to put in the film and not in the film. And it's already too packed, if you will. Already people are saying, it's a great film, but let's get it down to 60 minutes. Who's got 96 minutes? So we're going to be creating like 5 to 10 minute little videos. And, to what you were saying, Dr. Schultz, that it's important to have all these, personal stories. But this book, it's called Active Resistance. It's by Judith Fries Wright, and she was a freedom rider. And it's amazing because she, she was just a young Jewish student who read the Exodus story and was motivated to like change her life. She wanted to have meaning, and she was in, jail for 30 days, and her story is extraordinary. And we interviewed people who worked with Mrs. Boynton as well, who was one of the civil rights leaders during Selma, that she would have Jewish women meet with her privately, and bring her money and all those stories. And I think all these individual stories matter. So I think as many stories as we can collect, and that's another goal we have, is that as I'm traveling around the United States, there are so many stories that people don't know. So some of the greatest books that are out there on Black-Jewish relations is based on what's out there. So when I interviewed Reverend C.T. Vivian, for instance, he said, nobody asked him about this history ever. I mean, nobody even, and once he started talking about it, like, we spent days, and then not even having anything to do with our film. It was pretty extraordinary. I was out of town at the time, but the African American Museum in Detroit had invited Reverend Vivian to be a lecturer for Black History Month. This was like, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, or maybe 3 years ago. And he started talking about Rabbi Heschel and the rabbis in St. Augustine. And it was amazing that I don't know if he would have necessarily focused on it, but because I was asking him questions, then his mind sort of turned to this as part of this conversation. So, so that's just what I think. Personal stories and collecting them do have importance.
Thank you.
Can I just follow up on that? I just wanted to commend you, Sherry, for really having the forethought to document so many important people on this topic, but also the extent of your interviews. You have a lot more footage than what shows up even in your film, and I'm sure that footage is going to be an important historical document. So I know your doctorate is not in history, but your instincts for history are quite profound.
Yeah, and there's another book that I would also recommend that I think Dr. Haynes includes in his book is there's a doctor, his name is Dr. Ephraim Isaac, who's the first African-American president. He's an Ethiopian Jew, actually, but he fought for African studies at Harvard. And, people don't even know really about him. And he speaks 17 languages. He's absolutely extraordinary. And I think he's a gift while, to really, interview him, because I think he has so much to talk about and so much history in terms of, like, Cornel West was his student. You know what I'm saying? So some of these people that, that we know, he was his teacher. He was a Jewish man who was his teacher, Cornel West's teacher. So I'm saying this is, and he fought for African studies as a Jewish teacher, and he had to teach. He tells a story where he had to teach Malcolm X, all the history of Malcolm X. So it's pretty amazing.
Well, I did not know he wrote that book. Did that just come out?
No, I think it's called From Abraham to Obama.
Yeah.
So everyone, we're right at the end. And so I want to close with kind of a final question to all of you. One of the phrases that's bouncing around in my head after watching the film, and I'm afraid I can't remember who said it, but it's this idea that we don't need just words and prayers or words and hope. We need acts. And I'd like to invite Sherry if you would like to say anything about what you're doing at Temple or your activism. You're surrounded by professors who are studying this stuff because we care about these things. We want to change the world, but you're on the ground. So I'd like to give you the first chance to speak.
Thank you. So yes, I remember this quote as well, and I cannot recall who said it, but it stuck with me as well, amongst many other quotes in the film. And I think it really starts by being brave, right? Stepping out, deciding that it's important enough, these issues are important enough to make to take action. It's important. So I believe there was a quote from a rabbi during the, oh my goodness, was it the march? I believe there was a march. And the quote was about the silence, right? So not being silent, and that the silence was the most dangerous thing. I know I'm butchering the quote, I'm sorry. So I think that's at least where I think that's the most important part, is actually not being silent. So speaking out within our communities, speaking to our leaders, talking within our religious communities, our educational communities, in our homes, having the conversations. Dr. Rogers, you mentioned at the very beginning of the conversation, having the conversations, parents having to have conversations with their children. I've had to have those conversations with my children. So I think it starts with that. And it's interesting because my 18-year-old son told me today, he said that this was one of the biggest years of growth that he's had in terms of social awareness and, realizing the injustices in the world. And a lot of it stemmed from these conversations that we've had. Sorry if you hear him in the background, actually. So again, I think it starts from there. It starts from action, having the conversations, not being silent, and then taking the steps after.
To add to that.
I'll just add one small thing, which is to presume that we don't know. We often presume that we think we know, we have a little bit of information on people. We really have to approach this with an open mind and really challenge ourselves.
Thank you. Dr. Schultz?
Yes, I was just going to say, speaking very personally, I think anyone who has grown up after the Holocaust is always inspired by the idea of righteous Gentiles. So I think there's almost a horror of standing idly by when you see injustice. And we have all of these incredible examples in the film and in the history of people who just took that step and took that risk.
I just want to add another quick story based on what you just said. There was a Holocaust survivor, a woman Holocaust survivor, who lived in a neighborhood, and one of the Black families in her neighborhood, there was a fire and she was helping out, and the Reverend invited her to his home for dinner. And he was serving some meat, and she was an Orthodox woman, and Dr. Martin Luther King was invited as well. And he says, Reverend, and then she says, I can't eat meat. And he brings her some vegetables with some of the sauce. And Martin Luther King is explaining kashrut, is explaining kashrut to the Reverend. I mean, that story is amazing to me. That here Dr. King understands the Orthodox, the whole kashrut and explaining it. And it was just, and they were all together, and I don't know, stories like that just warm my heart.
Thank you so much. Dr. Sadie, you get the last word.
Well, I think people have said what needs to be said and what I think is important. The movement towards justice is always a constant struggle. We're one humanity with our diversity, but I think the goal is to expand the envelope of freedom so that everyone's creativity, everyone's aspirations can be fulfilled. We live in a world of tremendous inequity, inequality, oppression, and justice. And as the father of a 2.5-year-old, I hope that we're able, with all the multiple crises it's really we almost feel an existential dread, but we also feel there's an opportunity here. There's the ecological crisis, there's the economic, political crisis, all of these things. But we saw this mass movement in the wake of George Floyd's killing. And it was multiracial, multi-ethnic. In fact, in time, you may see it as a very important chronological marker, right? And perhaps in that, we have hope for the future.
Beautifully said.
Please let me offer thanks to all of you for participating in this wide-ranging and rich conversation. I feel honored to have had you with us tonight. And thank you to our audience who, you're here. If you're in Canada, maybe you're facing a blizzardy story night and you shared your evening with us here to talk about something that's really important. And we're grateful to have you here, and thanks to all the questions, comments. If we didn't get to your question or comment, I will share that with our panelists. Also want to let you know upcoming programming on March 10th, we're doing some joint programming with Gratz College in Philadelphia with the author of Mouse, the graphic novel from the Holocaust. That's coming, as well as an upcoming talk on anti-Semitism in Malaysia.
Can I just
Sorry, you've got your event, but you sent me a photo and it's so blurry.
I know. I'm going to announce it, and then Dr. Butler will send it out. But basically, on February 26th, 9 o'clock Eastern time, we're doing an event with an NGO from the UN, and Dr. Clarence B. Jones, who is 90 years old, will be speaking in honor of Black history. But there will also be a 93-year-old Holocaust survivor who is going to be speaking, and Alexis Scott, whose father was the Black soldier and a photographer during the concentration camps. And her family started the newspaper, the Black newspaper in Atlanta. So I think it's going to be a dynamic conversation. It's going to be 2 hours. So if you want to hear from 90-year-olds that, still are out there fighting to really get the message out, come listen.
What's the best way for people to find you, Sherry?
Spillthehoney.com. www.spillthehoney.com. It's our foundation. And there's a newsletter that students are getting involved with where, they're looking up history, they're sharing it. It's like this Instagram where all the college students are doing it, which is exciting. So I'll send you that information. Thank you so much.
So last, a couple of personal thank yous from me. Thank you to Dr. Pamela Walker from the History Department at Carleton, who found this film and sent us to you, Dr. Rogers, and made this first thing possible. Thank you to Rabbi Michael Berg at Temple Israel, who has been so supportive of this event, and our other partners, the U.S. State Department and the History Department at Carleton. And also to my team at the Zolokhovich Center with Dr. Susan Landau-Chark, who led the charge, as well as all of our student staff. So hope to see you all again soon. Have a lovely evening and be well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.